Ladies and gentlemen,
Jetzt bin ich hier, ich fliege morgen.
I want to you all, and I'm very happy that so many made it to this discussion we have tonight, despite of the nice weather. As I wrote in one tweet today, divert yourself from useless speculation about new governments which will be built afterwards. It's good to come here because here we get hard facts and maybe it is more interesting than just this kind of speculation. Now, I want to welcome all of you, and in particular welcome the former director, Mr. Lincoln, who is here, who always has been interested in that subject, always has been helpful in organizing the event. The deputy director has left. It's about gerechte Intervention and just intervention, and R2P. Now, we had a discussion here in a smaller room, and it was so interesting and so controversial in one sense, but so useful that we said we have to publish a book. And the book is published. The book just came 2 minutes ago, so it's still hot from the printing press. Probably will be not enough samples for you, but I think you can buy some of them, and then I think it's a list so you can get them afterwards. I think it's very well done, and I can say that because the major contribution comes from Professor Hans Gärtner and Stephanie Fenkert from the Institute. They did a very hard job in reading again the articles which came in, and of course we have a very nice cover, artistic cover, because if we do a good book, it must be an artist who is contributing. And Michael Chamarani-Strohmeyer is also here. The first row. I hope you are happy about the cover and your artful contribution. Now, let me say only some few words before I ask the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Herr Lance, to make some introductory remarks. R2P had on hype, would one say today, in the media language of today, some years ago, especially inside the UN family, not directly the UN as an organization, but the UN family. Different countries were very active. One of them was Canada, for example. And everybody who was interested in international politics, international law, was speaking about R2P and the necessity to protect if people are in danger, and to intervene also military if people are in danger. Now, in the meantime, this is my personal impression, this R2P has been very often misused just for justification of some of the military intervention. And of course, if you say I protect, the people, and I have to do that because of humanitarian considerations, then everybody would say, yes, that's good. Okay, that's justified. Now, we have different cases. One of them, and probably we'll discuss it also with our colleague from Russia, is of course in Libya, where there wasn't much criticism about overdoing, surpassing the limits and the obligation one has to have after UN resolution has given the power and the possibility to intervene. Well, there will be different interpretation of it, but my interpretation is that this R2P is a good principle, but if it is misused, then very often the principle as such is damaged. And that's what happened in the past years. Now, only two brief remarks. If you look into recent documents, there are two documents I want to mention. The one is the Strategic Review of Defense and National Security by France, which was published some days ago. And I was looking and I thought France is very active in international intervention, so what does it say about R2P? As far as I saw, especially in the official translation, and in an interview of the Minister of Defense in Le Monde 2 or 3 days ago, R2P is not mentioned anymore. So that can mean they are not interested in R2P anymore, or that could mean we do it when we need it, and then we come with a justification afterwards. But all the past interventions are not mentioned, but it is very clear from the strategic review of defense that France insists on widespread autonomy in their defense capability and capacity. And I think that, of course, they also have some relation to the European Union, but I still think it is strange that a country who justified one of the interventions doesn't even consider, was it right, was it wrong, or what will be in the future. So this is only one remark, and the second remark I have, that was recently briefly published by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a study, Missed Opportunities for Prevention, a study of US policy and atrocities in Syria since 2011. US policy and atrocities, of course, not US atrocities. I said briefly because this study had to be withdrawn from the website of the Holocaust Museum because there were several interventions against it, saying how can a Holocaust Museum publish something where the conclusion is, and that's interesting, there was probably no real alternative to what the US did. All the alternatives which were scrutinized by different researchers came to the conclusion, well, whatever we would have done, unfortunately, we could not have prevented the atrocities. Just briefly, to go into details, but only for briefly, it says, though it is often stated that mass atrocities are preventable, the Syrian case demonstrates painfully that some episodes of mass atrocities are more difficult to prevent than others. This study, a very careful study, suggests that a variety of factors which were more or less fixed made it very difficult from the beginning for the US government to take effective action to prevent or mitigate atrocities in Syria, even compared with other challenging policy contexts. I could go much more into detail, but this is only an introduction. So what I want to say and remind you that R2P is, in a way, in a limbo, in a very difficult situation after it has been misused. And there are many situations where it is difficult to decide, are we right? If we would now go into and save the lives, are we wrong? And of course, one of the cases in the past, which is also dealt with in the book, is the Kosovo issue. But still, there are many discussions if it was right or wrong, not from the legal aspects, but from the factor aspects. But it is a very, sometimes ambiguous concept. As clear as the idea is, as justified as the idea and the principle is, every case is different, every case has to be looked at with very careful considerations if that intervention is good or bad. But in any way, what I want to say is that military intervention should be dealt with in a very careful way. The past 10 years, I would say, have shown that some of the big countries used their military interventions not in that careful way, did not think about the aftermath, did not balance the pro and contra of this intervention, did not have the responsibility to protect also during their interventions, and that I think made the principle a bit dubious. Also on the other hand, I think we should not give up some basic ideas that the international community, and I underline the international community, should not accept everything which happens in the world just with the consideration it's inside a nation state. Because people have the right to be protected, but it must be done in a much more careful way than it was done in the past decade. That's at least my personal opinion. Now, before we come into the discussion and Stephanie Finker takes over, I may ask Erwin Lanz, our honorary president of the Institute and former Minister of Foreign Affairs, to give his opinion about the responsibility to protect the military intervention. Erwin, bitte sehr. Thank you very much.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear supporters of all endeavors world. Permit me some remarks from the point of view of a former politician who is looking very carefully what is going on now, but can refer to his experiences in the past. In the 19th century, Europe developed capitalism after mercantilism. The US version started immediately during and after the northern states had won the Civil War. Today, we see all over the globe different versions of capitalism. Parliamentarian democracy, a mix of capitalism and authoritarian nationalism, and the communist version of capitalism in China. They all have in common to fight for commodities and markets by all means, even military interventions. That's nothing new. In my capacity as foreign minister of my country, I had to accompany our late federal president, Dr. Kirchner, on his state visit to US President Ronald Reagan in 1983. During this visit, we were invited to a typical Californian cattle ranch, and I met there Mr. Black, husband of Shirley Temple Black, a former key star in black and white films in the 1930s. He praised Saddam Hussein for keeping open Sharq al-Arab against Iran. Black was in oil business in Iraq. Even after the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam in 1990, and after his defeat by Desert Storm, he could remain in power. And the Sharq al-Arab was still open for US business. At the same time, Britain, at that time ruled by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, had delivered heavy weapons to Saddam Hussein, which could have been only paid back if Saddam could survive. But on the other hand, British troops were part of the UN legitimated army under US leadership, now fighting against weapons produced and sold by their own country. In the final war against Saddam's Iraq, George W. Bush fought without the United Nations, with so-called like-minded countries only. The so-called war against weapons of mass destructions, which didn't exist. A criminal war without punishment for the criminals. If you're strong enough, you can do what you want. Feast law. According to serious sources, President Trump is now going to order an area bombing of the Taliban-controlled areas in Afghanistan. The population should pay for the Taliban occupants. They have not voted for them. They have not invited them. Is this the start of a new kind of humanity service? In 1944-45, I've suffered from this kind of warfare. The Nazis were in their bunkers. The non-Nazis were killed. here in this town. If these news are correct, Austrian military experts have to leave Afghanistan. And the United Nations have to cancel any legitimation as a UN mission. My recommendation: no military support to any action, even of veto powers, without UN legitimation. Systematical enforcement of conflict prevention, learning from the Syrian case. Thank you in advance for your contributions to responsibility to protect and how to reach the target without being abused by economically and militarily dominating countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Land, for your contribution. Before we start with our panel discussion, I would like to ask Dr. Wilhelm Hopf, the publisher, for just a few words on the book and on the... Yeah. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I have to say many thanks to President Svoboda of the International Institute of Peace, and of course to the editors, Mrs. Fenkrat, President Svoboda, and Professor Gärtner. With Professor Gärtner, I published quite a lot of books in the past, so international politics and peace research are one of our topics in our international publishing house. I'm in a quite comfortable position when I have editors and authors with me, so I have to say very much of the contents of the book. I just can say it's a very good book, you should read it, and of course you should buy it first. Yeah. I remember some years ago when we published a book of Professor Gärtner about President Obama. We were discussing it here. We published this some days after the election. I think it was 2 or 3 days after the election. And at the end I said, well, you should buy it. And one of the American guests said, well, in America you would not say buy the book. We would say in America, go to the internet and do a download. So maybe this is a difference between America and Austria and Germany. Yes, well, the book is quite cheap today, only 20 euros. If you buy it later, it will be, I think, 35. So, it's a good chance. And I released a small secret. And I think the first Obama election was 9 years ago, about. And Professor Gärtner was writing a book about the next American president, and he was not quite sure which will win the elections. And so he wrote 2 manuscripts, and we printed 2. One of Obama and one, which is very rare, about President McCain. And so we were able to deliver the book and present it here with the right president. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now it's my turn, and I would very much start with actually saying you're very much welcome to all of you. I'm happy that you're all here, even though yesterday was a very turbulent day of elections in Austria. I'm happy that still so many came, and the weather is nice, so you're warmly welcome. And next is I would like to welcome our panelists. I'm going to introduce you later. And then I would also like to say thank you to all the authors who have been working with us in this anthology. Also the ones who are not here, the ones who are here, like I see Dr. Reisner over there, welcome. And I hope you're going to have an interesting evening starting from now. Maybe for the procedure, I would like to say that I'm going to ask a very short question to the panelists. Then each of them has about 12 minutes to answer it, and I hope that we can afterwards get into a discussion with you. then we are having a small break, and then we are having a next panel. So both panels are very, very interesting, so don't leave afterwards. It's going to be still much more interesting afterwards. Okay, so armed interventions, as Mr. Svoboda and Foreign Minister Abelanz already mentioned, in armed interventions into domestic conflicts have been named as ultima ratio in the last years in order to fulfill the international responsibility to protect or the right of self-defense. However, the questions of the reasonability, efficiency, and the extent of those interventions are at the very core of the discussion. Which intentions are eventually leading to an armed intervention, and on which theoretical and judicial basis is it exercised? Who is realizing them, and which purposes are behind them? When is an intervention seen as efficient and effective and sustainable? I will start with our first panelist, Professor Heinz Gärtner. He is a political science scientist and lecturer at the University of Vienna, the Diplomatische Akademie Wien, and the Danube University. As well, he is on advisory board of the International Institute for Peace. Heinz, R2P in concept and in theory is quite a new concept. After massacres and genocides in Rwanda and Srebrenica, the international community realizes its failure to handle those issues properly. Nevertheless, a military intervention always comes with human losses. Is there such a thing as a just war?
Can I use this?
Yes.
Yes, Stephanie, there is the authors of the report, I think, such as a just war. First of all, I want to thank President Svoboda and Honorable President Lanz for his introductory remarks, and also Stephanie. She did really the heavy lifting here for this book. And in the hindsight, I want to thank publisher Hopf for printing 2 books together, also, without knowing whether you would sell one of them. So thank you very much. So I'm talking about R2P, just war, as Stephanie mentioned, and here we are. And what is R2P? As Hannes Svoboda said, it's a set of principles to prevent or stop mass atrocities. Those principles have been developed in response to a report by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2000, in which he called for collective action to intervene against vicious mass crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. We discuss a little bit now these principles and what are the legal and what are the legitimate basis for intervention to prevent these mass atrocities. In response to Kofi Annan's report, the Canadian government established an interdependent international commission on intervention and state sovereignty in 2000, and they issued the report. This is the report, and this is the academic version. So there's an academic version which is 3 times as thick as the policy report. The report looks at historically at 3 cases why they thought these principles very important, and the 3 historical cases are Rwanda in 1994, where about 800,000 Tutsis have been massacred, and the United Nations didn't do much to prevent it. Then the next case would be Srebrenica, 1995, where 8,000 Bosnians have been executed, where the United Nations had a very weak mandate to prevent it.
By the way, Jan William Honey wrote a book about this case some time ago. And the third case would be the NATO bombardment of Kosovo in 1999, where NATO acted without an UN authorization. So the report consists of mainly three pillars. The report is about the responsibility to act, and states should be the first actors to react and to act, and the primary responsibility to act lies with the state itself. But if the state is unwilling or unable to protect its citizens, if they are, as the report says, a conscious, shocking situation, the responsibility falls to the international community, and first of all to the United Nations Security Council. And the third pillar would be that this international community might also use coercive measures, including military intervention, that what we are talking about. So, where do these principles come from? What are these principles? What are the conditions? When and how force should be used? And the report draws upon the criteria of the just war. Just war concept has been discussed by peace researchers for many decades, but it goes back to the Christian tradition until the 5th century. Augustinus, and another important name is Thomas of Aquin in the 13th century. I'm not going to into this debate now, but I'm looking at the more modern criteria of the just war. And here we have these principles: the just cause, the right intervention, the last resort of intervention, the proportionality, reasonable prospect, and the competent authority. So I briefly go through them. The just cause, we will have a just cause if there's a large-scale loss of life, like ethnic cleansing. There's, of course, the question, as the words say, large-scale. What is large-scale? So somebody has to make a decision about this. Then the second, right intention. The right intention means that the primary purpose of an intervention must be to hold or to avert human suffering. There might be other motives involved, like geopolitical ones, like oil. The report doesn't deny it, but the report says primary purpose must be humanitarian. However, most of the time it's hard to separate the geopolitical issues and humanitarian intentions. The next one would be last resort. So every option has to be explored and exhausted before there will be a military intervention. That means in terms of the UN Charter, the Article 41 of the UN Charter has to be proven inadequate before we move on to Article 42, which includes the use of force. Humanitarian NGOs and the military says last resort is too late, we have to have early action. So we had this debate, especially in the Balkans, in Bosnia and in Kosovo, the state intervention came too late. And we have proportionality. Proportionality means using the minimum force necessary. In contrast, the military would argue minimum force necessary is not enough. We have to use overwhelming force. So that was the Powell doctrine after the Erwin Lanz mentioned after the war against Iraq in 1993. A reasonable prospect means that the outcome of an intervention must be better than the previous situation. So the loss of life during the intervention must not, and after the intervention, must not be higher than those lives saved. So, and then we have the last criteria, the competent authority. Briefly touched upon it. Who decides what is just, what is the right intention, what is proportional, what is a reasonable outcome. In the past, in the Christian tradition, most of the time the princes themselves would decide what is just and good for them. Now we have a debate on competent authority, and the report says, a little bit ambiguous about it, that Chapter 7 of the UN Charter empowers the UN Security Council to be the competent authority. And if the UN Security Council fails to discharge its responsibility to protect the civilians in a conscious shocking situation, the Security Council might suffer, and the authority might go over to regional organizations and to regional organizations or the UN General Assembly. If the UN Security Council is not a competent authority, what would be the alternative? And Eric Lantz alluded a little bit to this, that if there is no one competent, internationally recognized authority, any state could maintain and claim the right to intervene. So it could be the US, it could be the European Union, it could be Russia, African Union, the Shanghai Cooperation, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Organization of American States. So anybody could claim to decide if we don't have the UN Security Council or internationally recognized competent authority. That was the World Summit of 2005. Ursula might talk about a little bit about this as well, I guess. So, the World Summit recognizes the Security Council as the competent authority, and since this World Summit, several, altogether about 50 UN resolutions referred to this responsibility to protect. The most famous one, of course, was the resolution on Libya, the resolution 1973. And the problem with this resolution was that at the end of the intervention there was a regime change. The concept of the responsibility to protect started very much because, especially Russia would say, if we have this concept in regime change, so we would not support this R2P procedure anymore. The Russians and the Chinese and the Germans abstained at the resolution in the UN Security Council on the vote on the resolution 1973. If you look at the criteria, if there is a regime change intentionally, and the decision would have been made before, an outright decision about to change regime, it would contradict the criteria of the right intention. This is not the right intention. However, the report also says if a just cause cannot achieve otherwise, the purpose of the intervention could be other than humanitarian. So one could argue without Gaddafi in power, the achievement of the protection of civilians could not have been achieved. What tremendously failed in Libya, of course, was the responsibility to rebuild. The report also talks about the responsibility to rebuild afterwards, after the conflict has been stopped, everybody left, and now also the situation, there is no reasonable prospect, the situation might be worse than before. So let me conclude. The just war is the doctrine, as Stephanie asked me, is the basis for intervention. Looking closely at the two concepts, the responsibility to protect and the just war, there's a different rationale, however. The just war stresses the right to wage war. And the right to wage war comes before the imperative to avoid civilian casualties. Responsibility to protect turns it around and uses the just war criteria just because they want to avoid massive casualties and atrocities. And there's one more principle in this report. In the report, the humanitarian norms and principles come above and before state sovereignty. And the last one, what I already mentioned, is if there is no other legitimate authority, anyone could claim to intervene. Insofar, Gary Lanz was right, that's the only competent authority we have is the UN Security Council to decide what is just and what is the right intention and what proportionate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I took down maybe just some words on what you just said, Hank. I think what was very important is that the Security Council can be the only legitimate authority to talk to when R2P as a military intervention case. You also addressed the responsibility to protect. And what I think you also said is that R2P is not a right to intervene, but it is actually more about a right to protect. Okay, now let's come to our next panelist, Angela Kane. Angela Kane has been United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and she has also been the one responsible to the deployment of the chemical weapons in Syria in 2011, was it? 13, sorry. Angela, she's also Vice President of the International Institute for Peace, and I'm very happy that she's here, so you're welcome. Angela, with your long career in the United Nations, you're well aware of the manifold challenges when it comes to armed conflict, either between states but also between non-state actors. International law tries to protect especially civilians, and different concepts have been developed so far. What do you think is meant with protection of civilians, and how is the concept included within the international community?
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And I must say that it's been very interesting to also look at this. And I think that what we must really remember is that these concepts are very different. Responsibility to protect is not protection of civilians. And we also have human security, and then we have something called rights up front. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but before I do that, I'd like to give you a little bit of a background in terms of what happened with the protection of civilians, which is something that the Security Council employs. It has never used the word responsibility to protect. We must remember that. They talk about protection of civilians. And what happened is that in the 90s, you had a tremendous shift from interstate conflicts to intrastate conflicts. So all of a sudden, you had a very different landscape that you are facing. And Heinz Gärtner has already mentioned Kosovo, he's mentioned Rwanda, he's mentioned Srebrenica. So those were the issues that the international community was involved with. And the Security Council was very closely involved in other crises as well. I mean, think about, for example, Somalia. And so there was this very powerful awareness internationally, and there was a very strong criticism also of the United Nations, because the United Nations was seen as not being effective in this. And it's very interesting because I was a lot in the Security Council in the 90s. I lived through all of the discussions on Srebrenica, on Rwanda, and I will never remember there's always a certain revisionism afterwards when you talk about this. And there was Madeleine Albright about 10 years after the Rwanda crisis occurred, and that was in 1994, so that was 2004. And she basically stated very publicly that no, we did not know what was happening. The Security Council was not at all informed. And I can tell you that that is an absolute untruth, if I'm not to call it a lie. It's kind of a nicer word for it, maybe, because the G word, the so-called genocide word, was not allowed to be mentioned in the Security Council. This was extremely important because it would have meant to talk about a genocide, because the responsibility to protect did not exist at the time. It would have meant that there was a necessity to intervene. And the United States, coming out of Somalia in particular, where you had a UN operation together with an American-led operation side by side, was unwilling to go anywhere near the continent of Africa. So that is one of the first time. But in the 90s, the Security Council for the first time ever expressed concern about the erosion of respect for humanitarian, for human rights, and for refugee laws, and also the humanitarian principles in armed conflict. And they condemned the deliberate targeting of civilians. So that was the origin of this whole development. And they therefore considered specific measures in situations where civilians were targeted, and not only targeted, but where humanitarian assistance was deliberately obstructed. And the first time this was ever put into motion was in Sierra Leone in 1999. And they decided in a resolution, first time ever, that the United Nations may take the necessary action to ensure the security and freedom of movement and its personnel and so forth, and to avoid physical violence. And then another shift occurred in early 2000 when the Security Council, rather than looking through a country-specific lens, because by that time every resolution dealt not with a theme, a thematic address, but with a country-specific lens. And so they basically they adopted a resolution, and that recognized that such situations could trigger charter responsibilities. And this was really a monumental step that was unrecognized at the time. But let me talk a little bit about Kofi Annan's report that Heinz referred to, because it's very interesting. I was in the Department of Political Affairs at the time. Kofi Annan launched this concept in an address to the General Assembly in late 1999. And this was something that was greeted, I will tell you, to our surprise, with quite some horror, not only by the member states who you might think had something to hide or had something not complying with the international law, but also by many European states. And I remember we had a discussion with the Secretary General afterwards, and we were very surprised and taken aback, because we said this is something that really we thought that member states, particularly the Western states, would sign on to, and we were very surprised that they didn't. That led to the report of the Secretary General to put it forward, and that's basically where it is developed. To this day, you do not have an official, very unusually, some 18 years later, who is tasked with this responsibility. There is no special representative of the Secretary General for responsibility to protect. It was amalgamated in another mandate, but that still shows you how divided the opinions are. And before I go on for the protection of civilians, which is what I want to talk about, I want to talk about avoiding the confusion with other concepts. The first concept was that of human security, and that was initially launched, I believe, by Japan, and that arose from a 1994 Human Development Report, which was issued by UNDP, and that places individuals and their needs as the centerpiece of policy, but, and here comes the crucial difference, it reinforces the role of governments, and it does not deny the sovereignty of states. And the responsibility to protect does precisely that. It denies the sovereignty of the state. And it means that if civilians are facing mass atrocities, such as genocide, war crimes or crimes against humanity, and if the state is unwilling to protect the citizens or to guarantee the security of the citizens, other states can take coercive action to enforce and in the extreme use of force under Chapter 7. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Libya, which is why Libya has become a watershed where in many cases this is being evoked, that in case action is being taken against the state, it could be a pretext for regime change. That's a very, very important concept. And then there was another initiative after the responsibility to protect, and that is basically in December 2013, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had an initiative called Human Rights Up Front, or Rights Up Front. And this was really coming out of the situation in Sri Lanka, which had faced tremendous atrocities in the settlement of the military, of the Sri Lankan government against the Tamil Tigers. And there was a very critical report of the UN actions in that country, meaning that the UN really hadn't done enough to do anything about this. But again, in Rights Up Front, it says that the states have the primary responsibility to protect their own populations against violations of human rights. So this is really the very crucial difference. Can you intervene as a responsibility to protect as another state from the outside, and actually do you have an obligation? And when you look at the situation in Syria, that's really, as we call it in the United States, where the rubber hits the road. I mean, doesn't that mean R2P would necessarily mean that you have an obligation to intervene in this particular case? But I'm getting away from this, coming on from this. I want to talk a little bit about the responsibility to protect. And what this council is doing is holding now, and this comes after this Sri Lanka start, rather slow start in 1999, it's holding a twice-yearly debate on this issue of protection of civilians. And it is a tradition that was started then, continues now. There's always a briefing by the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, since it is a humanitarian issue. But then starting about 10 years ago, they added the Department for Peacekeeping Operations, since they had the responsibilities on the ground. And then also 2-3 years later, they added the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, again broadening this thematic team about this. And the scope of this protection was clearly evolving, and it was always specified. In 2006, for example, the Council added protection of journalists, media professionals, associate personnel, and there were some member states that argued for further broadening the concept, and they also added children, they added demobilization of combatants, curbing hate media. So all of a sudden this kind of broadened out in a lot more, but civilians. It was specified who was being protected, but also were there other issues that needed to be looked into. Now, one difficulty of the protection of civilians definition is that there is no definition. There is no agreed definition on this. And the protection of norms is clearly outlined in the 1949 Geneva Convention and the subsequent protocols. But the physical protection through the missions that the UN is being mandated to really has no definition, and the Council so far has not been able to specify at all what does this actually mean, to implement, to give a mandate of protection of civilians to peacekeeping missions. What does it actually mean? So it's been left in a very vague and diffuse manner. When you have what basically is when you have a peacekeeping operation in a country, what happens is that the population clearly expects that they're going to be protected in some way. And that used to be the case, except that was broken in Srebrenica, that was broken in Rwanda. But on the other hand, there's still an expectation that if the UN comes, we will somehow be protected. And what happens is, of course, that sometimes it can lead to tremendous massing of internally displaced persons. I mean, we've seen that in Sudan. I mean, there have been like hundreds of thousands, sometimes 180,000 people would amass in one area, and the UN simply, the peacekeeping operation, does not have the personnel to actually protect them. So there's another gray zone, because that is a disaster, could be in the making in case there are others who intervene, so forth. But what happens is that the peacekeeping mandates have also evolved, and they've become, if you look at peacekeeping mandates of, let's say, the 1980s or the 1990s, they are much shorter, and now they can have maybe 30 or 35 tasks, and also they can have tasks that go beyond just the peacekeeping, but they do include humanitarian measures. And if you think back about Kosovo in the early 90s or the mid-90s, there was a humanitarian coordinator, and that was called Sadako Ogata. She was a very feisty Japanese woman, and she basically said to us at the time, I do not want humanitarian assistance delivered with a gun. I want to be like the ICRC. I want to be like the Red Cross. This has to be respected by all of the people who are fighting on the ground. This is no longer the case. Now what you have, 20 years later, you have peacekeeping operations that are even structured in a way that incorporate humanitarian assistance. You can no longer bring very often humanitarian assistance into a country, and think about Syria even, without military protection. And that is a very important fact. Now, the Security Council has clearly grappled with all of these conditions and with all of the situations that they have confronted, but there were very strong commitments to maybe make action points or to have a formation of a council expert group on protection or protection of civilians that was proposed already 10 years ago, that they were simply taken note of, and basically nothing really much happened. Not everyone is always very happy with this debate. And I think that what happens is that there are a number of countries, and particularly Russia and China, have been very reluctant about this whole protection of civilians issue, primarily because it's expanded so much. And primarily also because does it really mean that there's regime change in the making if you go with protection of civilians? And the other difficulty that has been encountered is that the Security Council takes decision, and yes, it's the absolute authority, but you have 15 members of the Security Council, and the other members, there are 193 in total, so the other members are saying the Security Council takes decisions that binds us, and we do not think that the Security Council has the mandate from all of us to go and take binding measures that actually obligate us to take certain steps. And that is something that is very important to keep in mind, that it is not all consensual, if I can call it that. And when you come to the Security Council, the deadlock that arose over Syria has really put the debate on the civilians in armed conflict into very, very sharp focus. Some other situations were stabilizing, like in Mali, at least at the time. Now it's not very good. But on the other hand, the resolutions that the Security Council adopts and the actual actions that are being taken are often in sharp contrast. And I think that what is the Security Council able to do in the situation like Syria? I think we've all seen that because of the deadlock in the Council, because of the differing opinions in the Council, it has not been able to implement meaningfully these issues on the ground. Let me just say that internally within the UN Secretariat, there have also been efforts to address this. There have been suggestions made. There have been reports made. There have been several reports by the Secretary General to basically nudge the Security Council on this issue to say we need a definition, we need clear guidelines as to what is happening. And there's also the World Humanitarian Summit, which was held in Istanbul last year in May, which drew up some conclusions and actually urged states to condemn violations of international law and take concrete steps to ensure accountability. But again, this has not all worked very well. Now, the latest issue that we also had is we had the resignation of Carla del Ponte in August of this year. And Carla del Ponte was one member of a 3-member commission on accountability in Syria, crimes against humanity. And she resigned out of protest, and it made quite a bit of headlines. And she resigned because she sort of said, why are we investigating these crimes against humanity if nothing is happening politically in terms of no action is being taken to bring states to accountability? And when it comes to Syria in particular, I think the impossibility to come to a solution has been very, very visible in the international community. The several conferences that have been held to address this issue, also by member states, have not led to any concrete results. So I think that we're a little bit stymied in all of this. and I think it's very regrettable. And the last stymieing, if I can call it that, is also the accountability, very important, but accountability, it could be referred to the International Criminal Court, for example, particularly when it comes to Syria. But on the other hand, it has not been, and Fatou Bensouda, who is the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has basically tried to get to speak to the Security Council. I will tell you that she's not having much success to be invited by the Security Council in order to bring the case forward, because there is that referral mechanism. So when it comes to the protection of civilians, there's a lot of really good talk, but there isn't always the necessary follow-up. And I have a feeling that that's where it basically will stay. Twice yearly debate on this issue in the Security Council, but unless there is a meeting of the minds of all member states of the Security Council and not just several ones of them, this will not go forward, other than in certain specific situations that may be more limited in scope. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very practical insights. It was very interesting. You addressed that there are many concepts and different concepts, and they have to be different also. And you also talked about the contradiction when it comes to sovereignty and also the expectations of civilians, which I think is also very important when it comes to military interventions. You also addressed the legitimacy of the Security Council, which is always a challenge, and I think there's a lot of things we can discuss later, what you mentioned. Thank you. Now, Ursula Werther-Beach. I would like to welcome Ursula Werther-Beach. She's a researcher and lecturer at the University of Graz at the Section for International Law and International Relations. Ursula, the concept R2P is closely tied to international human rights. And what is the value of this concept within the international human rights discourse, on your opinion?
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And I just couldn't stop listening to what has been said on this panel here, coming from first of all on the conceptual side, also mentioning Sadako Ogata and all the things that happened in 2003 on and preparing the common understanding on human security of 2012. And also, of course, the criteria Heinz gave us in the very beginning on responsibility to protect on R2P. What is now? This is, I think, the question I have to try to find an answer. What is the relation to the human rights community, to the human rights regime, to peace and security at the global level and individually? My first observation on that would be that there is a cause, that the cause of human rights is deteriorating. It is maybe the same destiny as R2P in Le Monde, as was mentioned at the starting, and it's a deplorable state of play, I would say. Why that? I think that POC, which is the protection of civilians, is stuck a little bit in operationalizing. There you didn't find some ways in practical sense to overcome obstacles on the ground. Human rights, by contrast, is perhaps evading conceptually. This is very provocative, I tell you, for a human rights lawyer and also for international law, but maybe we have to grasp this idea and go through and think it to an end. The R2P, I would say, on the third, as a third pillar of this considerations and deliberations I just derived from that, is captured today by geopolitics. I think we cannot say that there is a impact of human rights on R2P. It is more or less a loss of impact of human rights to the advantage of geopolitics, and that's why I think we stand where we are in Ukraine, in Syria, and you name it. Establishing human rights criteria and in the international debate has had heights, of course. The era of explicitly making reference to human rights diminished. I can tell you, I can give you some examples. It's the Barrington Commission when it came to the accession of the Western Balkans in 1992, the World Conference of Human Rights in 1993. There you had this expressed human rights talk in all the debates. ACP negotiations, you probably know also the Lomé and Cotonou conventions between EU and a broad range of developing countries. Ended in 2000 by establishing an Article 8 where human rights were explicitly mentioned as essential elements of that given convention. And there's also a sanctions regime when they are violated. So today, when the whole ACP-EU convention is renegotiated, I think it's not possible to have this consensus anymore. The essence of the R2P in 2005 has already been touched upon. We all rely at the moment, so the translation into the four elements also of the elements of crime against humanity, Article 8 of the ICC, also the report of the UN Secretary General in 2009, which clearly stated there is a narrow impetus of R2P and on those four elements of crime, so that at that time the whole world was hopeful of having an instrument. And maybe coming now from a perspective of 2017, we can say that lobbying for the R2P at that time, also with Ed Luck and other people, was perhaps easier than negotiating. We are now in a position of negotiating here and there, and also we have the deceptions of any application case before, of some cases before. You can also see this trend in the work of the Human Rights Council. It's also badly damaged, I would say, what there is, what declarations and resolutions by that body concerns, and maybe we can end that landscape by citing Mogherini, the High Representative of the EU, with her global strategy of 2016, where human rights are really not postponed, but they are not so expressly at the forefront and upright as it could have been. It's a rudimentary, it's a principled approach to foreign relations of the EU, and fragility is said to be something you have to react in a certain flexibility. So you see that we have a comprehensive approach with several reasons and several principles to act, and the human rights are not anymore the first and the solely ground to act. So my first conclusion is that half of the human rights world, as it existed when the regime was evolving, the human rights defenders and all those people really working for that, have been changed to intelligence people, to human rights intelligence people, only working undercover. And I wonder if this is not too provocative. I think we have to do our job without saying, without tremendously telling the other parties where we stand and which is behind our action. So, what were the reactions to that downgrading of human rights? I see two in working already. It's first of all, it's a turn to the local. I think we have bottom-up approaches now. It's coming from the ICRC from 2015 report. And also, it has also already been mentioned by the World Summit on Humanitarian Affairs in 2016, where we had a really great, new start of a nexus between humanitarian aid, development, and peace building. And I think also the impact of peace support operations on the ground have been addressed in this picture of turn to the local. This is one answer you can give if the abstract and the great complex doesn't work. The other one is that you have perhaps to rethink your relationship to other states, to developing countries also. And I think there is a new notion of relationship and partnership since we have the Sustainable Development Goals. There's an attitude of mutual dependence, and I think the normal North-South dialogue has changed dramatically. It's a new form of universalism we speak about. The Sustainable Development Goals are speaking about the survival and the interconnectedness, and there we are politically arrived perhaps by a new partnership taking all on board. So these two reactions are underway, but what can be done in the future? What can we do to understand and to better react, to better counter this fall of maybe good concepts like R2P and human rights. First of all, multilateralism. I think we have an era of erosion of multilateralism, so you can only go into this direction. And with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, we have, and Antonio Guterres said that some days before, the boldest agenda for humanity. So maybe we have from there a new impetus to have a responsibility to rebuild, perhaps also a responsibility to build because of the new partnership I described. And perhaps this is also a new sort of impetus for the human rights regime. And my thesis is, and this I want to shortly perhaps present to you, is to incorporating the human rights regime, all the ideas into this peace-building and state-building complex. I think many lessons have shown that this would be the right way, also in connection with the UN Charter and other normative documents, and that this is the only way also we can maintain human rights at the moment. This reflects also what has been discussed in the International Network on Conflict and Fragility in Paris by the OECD, where we try to connect the fragility discourse, the discourse on peace building and state building, with the discourse on human rights. And I'm very grateful to my previous speakers in history, because I can just rely on what has been said. My starting point would have been history in that relation to see the ambiguity of interventions during the Cold War, when you had the apartheid and the India and Vietnam and Tanzania and etc. Cases where gross and egregious massive or systematic violations of human rights were high on the agenda, and also found a certain response in the UN Security Council resolutions. The second point is, after this ambiguity, would be the traumatizing of interventions. You mentioned already Somalia and the US reaction. Of course, we have Rwanda and other places of really traumatic situations. But we have at that time it's the beginning of the 90s also a UN Security Resolutions, let's say, movement where we have the cross-border and the spillover and the threat to peace argumentation. So there you have just interventions on the ground of human rights, but also already on the grounds of geopolitics. And this has been very much in the third period I would distinguish here, leading to the status quo, that we have illegal yet legitimate interventions, and this has also been reflecting East Timor and the already mentioned Kosovo case. So where we had an area of international administration big like that, and then of course the debate on capacities to do that in all cases. So where do we stand? We stand on the criteria that have been already mentioned, perhaps quoting different people from the New Haven School, Tezon or Nadine and co. There has been the regime change discussion, of course. We have also the voice of the International Court of Justice in the Nicaragua case, where humanitarian intervention per se was more or less rejected. We have also, besides the prohibition of the use of force, no common law on this use cogents, on the use cogents of the use of force. We have two concepts of sovereignty. It has been mentioned that this was a clear vision of Kofi Annan in 1999, very interesting and very visionary, to say that we have to protect people, not those who abuse them, and to introduce a second perspective on sovereignty with that. And what Kofi Annan also at that time wrote in an Economist article in 1999 is that we have not only to see the use of force, but also the other pillars which make intervention perhaps fruitful and successful, and we have to change national interest. And the two reactions I said they are, which are already which already arrange for some solutions, exactly are on these 2 points. We have to broaden our scope from the military robust reaction to other intervention schemes. It's peace building and state building, and we have also in our minds this new partnership, namely to see the national interest not only from our own Austrian or other perspective, but to combine that with a universal view. So perhaps in the 1 minute that is just my slot here, I would like to, in the end, show that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, really got deeper than the Millennium Development Goals in reacting in a non-military way. It's especially SDG 16 preparing for more engagement for resilient and inclusive societies, and this is, I think, the need for a new doctrine between fragility and the human rights, and also can be a bolstering or fostering the human rights regime which has undergone such a downwatering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ursula. You mentioned the problems of overcoming obstacles on the ground, then the R2P is captured by geopolitics. the erosion of multilateralism, which we can see not only in the human rights discourse, but also in international politics as a whole, and peace building and nation buildings, as well as the establishment of SDGs. Thank you very much. Now we had two scholars. We had a diplomat and practitioner, and now we also have a former politician. And I'm very happy to welcome Hannes Swoboda. He is the president of the International Institute for Peace. He has been member of the European Parliament for 18 years and was also the president of the Progressive Alliance of Social Democrats and Socialists in the European Parliament. You're welcome, Hannes. I also have a question for you, and it is what we have heard so far. Could R2P serve as a contribution to peace, or maybe better, what should be done so that R2P is contributing to international peace?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much also for what I heard, because it was very valuable contributions. My advantage is that I studied law, but I never practiced law, so I can perhaps see more the limits of the law and the legal situations. And let's say, the contradictions and the permanent fight between the legal situation, and you mentioned rightly the difference between legal and legitimacy, and of course the political situation. I was very much in favor of discussing these issues with R2P, knowing, of course, the limitations and the problems which arise in the practical way. I want to mention perhaps one or two practical situations. When I came into the European Parliament, one of the first tasks was to go with a small delegation to Kosovo. I saw in Kosovo what many people who praise the Serb situation and the Serb attitudes toward Kosovo, or accept it, what really happened. But I must say I have many Serb friends, so it's not for me to be either Kosovo or for Serbia. But I saw the violation of human rights in many respects in Kosovo. Now what do you do if you have that situation? And let's see, many of these acts which we saw also afterwards in television were not fake or organized by the Kosovo Liberation Army, which is not an army of angels, not at all. And I know, and I would say that many of the deeds of this army has not been brought to justice. Now, of course, you can say you have to start to talk. That was what I just said. You have to have other instruments, and others said it as well. But what do you do if a leader like Milosevic is not ready to talk, or is ready to talk but not to change the situation? Now, I will not say here is it justified or not, and we have a Kosovo contribution also here. What do you do then afterwards if the UN Security Council does not come to a conclusion? Because one of the countries, and I don't target specifically Russia, because we have many cases where the US, think about the Middle East, where the US was blocking the decisions. And I think here the responsibility to protect with all the legal frameworks and conditions which have been mentioned, especially by Hans Gärtner, does not work in some way. Of course, many of the arguments here I would fully support. Of course, you have to consider it, you have to consider the aftermath, the consequences, which have not been considered in many cases, including in Libya. But there are cases where if you take all these considerations into account, then you have, you don't have a decision by the Security Council, what do you do? And let's take the other example, the example of Rwanda. Would have been better that there would have been an intervention without Security Council, if some countries would have said, France, US, okay, we intervene? Or is it better that they don't intervene because there is no Security Council decision? I'm not an expert on Rwanda, but probably in Rwanda it would have been saved lives. In that case, would have saved life if the US and France and some other countries would have intervened. But that is an open question. But for me, at least, it's not clear. There was no Security Council decision, therefore, was no debate about having an intervention. In the case of Libya, all what we saw, in my interpretation, is that even with Security Council decision, things became worse than what before. Not that the regime was a good one, not at all. But it became worse because we have more people killed, we have a disaster in the whole situation, we have a promotion of terrorism, besides the refugee issue. So there is a decision taken by the Security Council, but I agree, overdone by the US, not because regime change as such, but the major mistake probably was not the regime change, but to go in, bomb, and then go out and say, okay, that's no longer our business. You have to do it yourself. And this is a hypocrisy in many of the cases. Syria, again, is another case. Again, I come with my personal experience. It was several times in Syria. It was not a democracy. And I spoke not only with Syrian officials, but I spoke also with people of the opposition, people who have been in prison before, were liberated, and others. But what had to be done, or what should an international community, to say this expression, this very vague, who is the international community, what should be done if he sees that in a country like Syria there starts some sort of a protest, revolution, revolt, whatever you call it, and you could think perhaps that in the end of the day it comes to a big conflict. The naivety has been, according to my opinion, not only I say yes, naivety has been to think Assad would give in. And naivety has been not to think about that Russia and Iran, out of different reasons, have a big interest in keeping Assad and have no interest in having a revolution and a regime change. And that, I think, is the biggest mistake. Not that they have not intervened, but they have not thought about what could come out of that kind of revolt. I remember very well people from the Liberation Army in Syria who told me when we met in Amman, that told them, why don't you give us arms, and we'll change the situation. And as I mentioned before, this report briefly being on the website of the Holocaust Museum, all the different scientists come to the conclusion, whatever we would have done, we wouldn't have saved life. In the contrary. Probably in the contrary. The one thing they agreed upon more or less, or some argued, said, maybe it was a mistake by Obama to say Assad must leave. And not only Obama, but also in Europe. Maybe if we thought about the solution, that this is not a condition for the solution, but maybe not mention that question, maybe then we'll have opened up channels to deal with it. So my conclusion is, first of all, I think what is not seen by all the debate very often is what would be the alternative at the beginning of a potential crisis to do, and what perhaps the UN should have done at the beginning, because if you have the right at the end of the day to intervene militarily, maybe it is better at the beginning to intervene in the sense of trying to bring people together and trying to find a solution. Of course, I know very well that many of these freedom fighters and people who were fighting against a dictatorship, because it was a dictatorship, or is a dictatorship, you saw the result, would have said, you are traitors, you are leaving us alone in our fight for freedom and liberty. And of course that was not in the line especially of what the Bush administration supported before. But nevertheless, I think before you have your wait to maybe then enact the responsibility to protect, you should think before what you can do to prevent a situation where you have perhaps the right or the obligation to go in and fight of it. So there's the one element, including also geopolitical situation. Who could have thought but maybe Mr. Nicotino comes later will convince me from the contrary. But who could have thought that Russia would say, okay, if Syria falls, Syria falls? Who could have thought that Iran would have been accept that Syria falls, including Hezbollah and others? Now you can make a moral judgment or not, but the reality is the geopolitical situation was one which would fight for the sustainability of the Assad regime, and I don't like it. But that's not the question if you like it or not. The question is how much life can be saved in the one strategy and how much life can be saved in another strategy. And Libya, I said already before, you could have a case to go in, but then you have to take the responsibility not only to protect but to stay as long as you have some sort of stability. If you are not ready to do it, and I can understand that you are not ready, that you shouldn't go in. And should make it clear to everybody. But of course, on the other hand, as I said before, there are cases, and Rwanda for me is more showing more the argument I wanted to say than Kosovo, but you can also call them Kosovo, where the UN Security Council is prevented to act, and you can feel the obligation to go into it. So for me, and this, I want to conclude because I want to be short to have possibility for some discussion. For me, we come from this kind of overemphasis. Once there are violations, you have to do something, intervene. The French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy was one of these typical, and André Glucksmann and others were typical representative. We are the police of the world, not in the sense of the US, but in the moral police, If there's a violation, we have to go in and to do it. And on the other hand, you have sometimes a situation today that you say, okay, we cannot do anything because of this overdrawing of some of the interventions, especially the Americans, but also the French and the British, like in Libya. I wanted to add some of these political arguments, but saying again, the biggest mistakes which have been made is just to let things go and to have only political or sometimes, as was mentioned by Avalanche, economic issues. And the worst thing is if you have political and economic issues, but you justify that with human rights, because that is the worst thing politics can do. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Hannes, you mentioned the disaster situation in Libya now, which was actually a R2P case in the beginning, and what you said is very important, is that you also have a responsibility while protecting, and maybe the most important factor, which is prevention, so that we do not even have to invoke an R2P case. With this, I would like to start the discussion. We have about 20 minutes left, I would say. I will collect 3 questions at once, and maybe if you have a specific question for a specific person, please address it to the person. And yes, who goes first? Yeah, over there.
Alexander Nikitin, I'm director of the Center for Euro-Atlantic Security in Moscow. It was mentioned several times that more or less all European countries have the same approach, but there are 2 bad boys, Russia and China, and they have a different approach. And yes, we do have different approach, so not every Russian shares the, so to say, governmental position. In our scientific community, we have liberal westernizers and we have conservative nationalists. And the problem is that we interpret the very notion of human rights slightly differently, more place an accent on the collective human rights. And if the whole this concept is stressing that countries like, say, Syria or Russia or Uzbekistan or Iran or maybe North Korea should be punished because they depress individual rights. We think that, for example, President Trump should be, he deserves regime change because he repressed collective rights of important parts of American population, or maybe a government in Madrid which is using persistently the police force against referendum in Catalonia is suppressing collective rights of the people. This is why it should be understood that the situation is not as simple as we have like a value of individual human rights on one hand and the value of sovereignty on the other. And the Western countries are saying human rights are so important that you can break through the sovereignty and if individual human rights are violated. Because the opposite position means that instead the value of sovereignty is so high and important that you cannot even touch it if there is a legitimate government here, and yes, violations of human rights should be tackled, but internally. But having said that, I want to ask a pointed question to Angela Kane. She presented excellent insight from inside the United Nations, and I want to ask. We have like two departments in the United Nations. DPKO, Department of Peacekeeping Operations, is doing approximately 16 peacekeeping operations every year on a parallel tracks. And we have Political Affairs Department, which does more than 22, 23 political missions every year. And they are in different baskets. Exactly, DPKO is extremely cautious. It is not touching sovereignty. It says we only operate when there is peace to keep. But political department did operations like Afghanistan, overthrowing talibs, Libya, overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi, Iraq 2003, overthrowing Saddam Hussein. All this was done under the banner of United Nations. So my question is, do you understand that looking from Africa or looking from Russia, United Nations is not only supported human rights, United Nations from time to time overthrows regimes.
Thank you very much. That was a question there, maybe because we are very on short time. Can you be a little bit?
I'll try to be very specific.
Yeah.
My name is Michael Plaster from the Academic Council on the United Nations System. What I hear today, R2P is dead. It's really R.I.P. Rest in peace. What is Canada, what Australia, the Centers for Responsibility to Protect saying now? I cannot believe that we all just sort of said goodbye. I would like some insight on what Canada and others are doing about their project. And then the concept of a just peace. We talked about just war, but we really talked about just peace. There was a brief mention about the International Criminal Court. I think we should be taking more advantage of the post-examination of the situation. And so far, there's been almost no use of the criminal court.
Thank you very much. You're on the back, please, yeah?
Hello, yeah, it's me, Oscar.
Can you stand up maybe so that
Hello, yeah, it's me, Oscar. I just wanted to ask that is it possible to view the Rohingya situation in Myanmar through the lens of today's topic, responsibility to project, which seems very like.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we can already answer. Who wants to answer? Maybe answer the first question was addressed directly.
I can start, and I thank you, Alexander, for raising that issue. I think doing a short presentation on this, you can only touch the surface. There's a lot of dissension also in the Security Council, and there's a lot of dissension also among the member states. So I mentioned China and Russia in terms of the opposition to POC, not opposition to POC, I'm not phrasing that correctly, but rather the reluctance to kind of give the whole gamut of the measures that are under POC sort of free rein. But that is something that is not only limited to those two countries or to those two states, but also others have the similar ideas. Now, the one difficulty that is with the protection of civilians in the Security Council is that you want to protect civilians, you put it in the mandate of the peacekeeping operations, but you don't give the right means to actually implement it. And so the UN is in essence bound to fail. And that is by some countries also saying, is this really the right approach? I mean, do we put in the mandate, we protect civilians, and then basically we kind of don't give the right means, we don't have enough people, and then the operation is bound to fail. That is one of the issues. Now, when it comes to regime change, I frankly think that the special political missions, which are the ones under the Department of Political Affairs, those are the missions without peacekeeping. There are no blue helmets. So they are very small, they're very nimble, they're more of a political mechanism. Afghanistan you mentioned, but Afghanistan, actually, that was under the DPKO, and only after the troops were withdrawn, of course, that's when it became a special political mission, meaning a political negotiating mission and others. I'm not going to justify everything that the UN does, because I also have a lot of criticism in many respects, but I think it's basically one way to go forward. And I agree that DPKO is cautious, and that is primarily because there is more for them at stake, if I can call it that, because DPKO has a lot of missions, has a lot of contributors from member states. So member states, when their own skin is in the game, if I can call it that, are usually a little bit more cautious than authorizing missions to go forward. But SPMs, the political missions, don't normally have the means to really effect regime change. They were not the ones to be behind the whole Libya debacle. But on the other hand, it's the overthrowing regime's fear that comes in from the Libya situation for subsequent situations, I think is a very, very important one, and that has put a lot of people on caution, a lot of states on caution, to say the UN should not be about regime change, and that is absolutely something that I very much agree with. So I'm on the side of those who are saying that. I'm going to leave the Canada question up to Heinz, I think. You're the one who brought up the Canadian one. But let me just say that when I just spent quite a while in New York and spent some time at the United Nations, but of course, under the Harper government, there wasn't really very much engagement by Canada in the United Nations in general. There were great hopes that when Trudeau took over, that actually that would change. We haven't seen all that much of it yet, but I think there are a lot of internal discussions that are going on, and there is more of a tilting towards an international, multilateral engagement than there was before. And the Rohingya situation in Myanmar, I don't think anyone has an answer to it, but you're giving an example. Is that an intervention possibility for R2P? Except R2P is not the concept where it can be used, because it doesn't exist in terms of an operational mechanism in the United Nations, and that's part of the issue.
Yeah, Heinz, you want to go?
Hopefully brief. Starting with Canada and why I didn't Canada follow up so much. Canada was very active at that time, and they even founded some academic institutions who work on human security, and even so it's a little different, but the report mentions human security as well. So it's within the framework of human security. So the Canadians set up, especially in Vancouver, institutes who work on human security and responsibility to protect. And then the Harper government came, and actually, let me say, Canada is a democracy, right?
So is the US.
It was not allowed to use responsibility to protect in Canada anymore in official documents. It was not allowed to use it because it was a concept of the previous government. So, sorry, is the Canadian ambassador here? I organized with the Canadian embassy here an event on responsibility to protect. They didn't want to talk about responsibility to protect, but only to protect on protection of civilians. So I kept on the academic level and say, okay, Canadians did a very good job in the academic field to work on this issue, but politically it was in Canada for domestic reason it was dead. So that's so the question is of the revival, at least as you mentioned. One word to the UN Security Council, which has its terrible weaknesses as well. So it is a terrible authority, but it's the best one we have. It's the best one we have. There is no alternative. So, and the Security Council can act. It does act. So most of the missions in Africa are covered by UN Security Council mandate, even under Chapter 7. And also it can react quickly. After 9/11, the Security Council adopted 3 resolutions on Afghanistan, on consensus, including with the votes of Russia, which includes also sending Enduring Freedom troops to Afghanistan. Accidentally, it happened at the same time when the report came out. So the report was presented to take into the Afghanistan situation, so that was a kind of a mismatch. It didn't really, the one blocked the other. There was no debate why Afghanistan could R2P used in the case of Afghanistan. But let me say one more thing. If we don't have the Security Council authority, we would have the claim of the right to intervene. So some states, for example, India would say we have not the responsibility to protect, we have the right to intervene, thinking of geopolitical reasons in Kashmir. So we had, of course, the case of Rwanda when the Security Council, the UN did not act. We have conscience-shocking situations when the Security Council should act. But we have other cases where the responsibility to protect should not be applied, and many American authors would want to apply to the Iraq intervention in 2003. So, and then we have sorry for the NGO people who are here, but we have the NGOs who claim they can decide when human rights are violated. And we have this philosopher in France, Henri Lévy and Glucksmann. They say they could judge. We have scholars in the field like Michael Walzer who said, I know where to intervene. And then he quotes the examples of Tanzania, Uganda 79, and Cambodia, Vietnam 79, India and Pakistan 71. These were cases where human rights violations were, and when the neighboring states intervened. But the neighboring states intervened not because they had the right intention to stop human suffering, but they had the intention to stop refugee flows, because there were the refugees in large masses came to their territory. So you can disguise human rights with geopolitics. So, and that's what states usually do when they cry intervention. So there has to be somebody who decides what is right for the right intention and what is just.
Thank you. Ursula, maybe?
That's why I'm just coming in hands on the last word. I just have to say that in this auditorium that human rights have no double standards, of course. Also in the Myanmar case, we have had discussions 2 weeks ago, I think, in the Human Rights Council, and there has been some declaration. There is an action, but perhaps it's not on the Security Council level at this level, but at least the Human Rights Council has taken note of that and is also acting on the advisory committee and a commission and those peaceful instruments of doing something. So I just have to have one idea to add to that, to what has been said here, concerning the question how bring R2P back to life again, because this strikes me, and perhaps I can come back to the two pillars I mentioned in my statement. The one is that, of course, the UN Charter had in mind some short and some hot reaction when there's a threat of peace or a conflict situation, an armed conflict situation. But it did not foresee at that time being a more long-standing, a longer term, a peaceful engagement, something which is breaching perhaps you mentioned that already in the Kosovo case, and East Timor also would be a case in point, that you can really bridge, or Libya, you can bridge what has been done by the Security Council mandate and the people who are piloting the flights and so on, and the aftermath of peace. I just want to show perhaps the relevance of one of the UN SG reports from 2009 on the aftermath of conflict, where the concept of peace building was set up in a more comprehensive way than before. this bridging was thought in this was one of the main messages of this report, and just in 2016 this new concept has been laid down in a UN Security Council resolution 2282, and I think from there we can have this new thinking on peace building, which connects human rights and fragility, as I said. The second point is, of course, the long-term perspective is the first point, and the second point is, of course, the culture of prevention and the early warning systems, and where we can do as a fragility assessment community much more to prevent, perhaps, and to see situations coming. So and putting some instruments into action.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just to continue very briefly, maybe it's a theoretical or rhetorical question, but why don't we have a responsibility to prevent and responsibility to mediate? Because that would be important at the beginning, and then in the end you can also perhaps say a responsibility to protect. But if we don't prevent or mediate, and for me, because it was mentioned, not the international community, but the EU, would for me also have responsibility to mediate in Spain between the different, perceptions about what should be done, at least informally. So I think that would be also an interesting concept to start with that, because, there are systems, as was just mentioned, but there is no real responsibility. And we see crisis coming, we see situation. Of course, I know there were special interests, the US or Saudi Arabia and also Turkey were not interested in mediation in Syria. But maybe there should be an international obligation to prevent what happened. We always start the discussion afterwards. When the crisis is here, when the first, or not only the first, killed people are here, and I think we should raise it around, and then we also can come to the situation of responsibility to protect. But that's all.
Just 1 second, we are already 10 minutes in the break. Maybe you can be very, very brief.
I'm very brief.
Okay, please go on. And we have a second panel, so there are still more options for questions later after the break and after the second panel. Thank you.
So, Mr. Svoboda, maybe you can make it even clearer what you said about R2P being officially mentioned in one of the actions mentioned, and if there is a body of rules that is written down, which is R2P, and can be used or not used. Is that the right understanding?
Yeah. The last question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, as Hans-Gärtner said, there are the rules. It's not law. It's not an international law. That is the problem. But I think there are some rules, but intervention will not stop because you can only say interventions are according to R2P. There will always be other interventions, but what we should fight for is that first comes the question of international law, and then, if it's not possible to work in any other way, as a last resort, you can perhaps go without the Security Council. But again, the first you have to involve the Security Council. We have very often intervention where the Security Council is not even involved.
Thank you very much. I will therefore now leave you to a short break over there. There is some refreshments, and let's start at 7:15 on time again. We have a very interesting second panel with a colleague from Russia, one colleague from Germany, from UK. And if you want to purchase the book, which is very interesting, you can do that over there. And see you later. Thank you.